Welcome back. You are watching Spectator TV. We are joined by Rebecca Weiser, weekly Specky columnist and editor of Quadrant. Rebecca, welcome to the show.
Delighted to be here.
Now, you've chosen to write about my least favourite human in Australia, former Labor Prime Minister Paul Keating, in an article titled Keating's Cuckoo Clock. Rebecca, Keating has a lot of failings, especially when it comes to economics, but he's entered the spotlight in recent weeks due to his comments on China, amidst the whole ASIO revelations that a former MP sold our country out. Now, Rebecca, why is Keating trending and what are you writing about?
Well, I really find this quite disturbing, what's going on, but Keating seems to have appointed himself the kowtower-in-chief for Australia. And as you rightly said, you know, he sort of, or as I write in the article, he seems to pop out of his cuckoo clock every so often to lash really whoever's in government. And, you know, he's taken quite a bipartisan approach to this. He's really, if you look closely at his foreign policy, his security policy, his defence policy, you'd have to say that he is well and truly in the China camp. And, you know, whatever Keating says, it sounds like, you know, not that different to an editorial you might read in China's The Global Times, which is a sort of the most feral wolf warrior utterings of, you know, on Chinese diplomacy. So it's I find it worrying, really.
Well, being positive about China is one thing, but implying that unmasking a former MP who is engaged in spying and other activities damaging to Australia's security would somehow damage our relationship with Beijing is a nonsense. Rebecca, would the Communist Party leader and President Xi Jinping avoid outing an Australian spy within his own party so as not to hurt Albanese's feelings? I mean, I suspect that wouldn't be the case.
No, far from it. In fact, all sorts of people get swept up in sort of a dragnet operations and hurled into prison and accused of being spies, whether they've done any spying or not. And some of them happen to be Australian citizens. It's a very common accusation, and since courts in China, you know, have no transparency, completely opaque, and, you know, tend to run for something like, you know, less than a day in which someone is sort of found guilty and cast off into a sort of Chinese laogai, a prison camp, sort of labour camp. You know, the notion that somehow this would be offensive seems to me certainly a strangely one-sided approach to this. But then I think that's how you could characterise a lot of what Keating says, and indeed a lot of what China says. There's no reciprocity. It's always they demand access to our markets, they demand to be able to interfere in our domestic policy. For example, telling us who should be allowed to hire a theatre. And, you know, they've clearly pressuring people not, for example, to allow Shen Yun to perform in Australian theatres, and it's been denied that on a number of occasions because they've been able to pressure state governments who have who've been able to be lent on.
And just one final point there on Keating. Is he in danger of becoming that internet meme of an angry man shouting at the sky?
Look, I think it's much more dangerous than that. If he were just an angry old man with no influence, it really wouldn't matter. He'd just be like the crazy uncle at a party who corners you and rants on about something of no relevance. But the reality is that he is exerting an extremely powerful influence on the Labor Party, and we've seen that over the last few days. We've seen how he has called for Mike Burgess, the head of ASIO, you know, not to be at the centre of our national security discussions, and lo and behold, Mike Burgess is now no longer going to be able to have a permanent seat at the National Security Committee of Cabinet. So we can see that actually he is shaping things with these rants, and I'm sure China is delighted, and I'm sure that's why China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi has said that he will be visiting Keating this Thursday in Sydney, and that will of course be a calculated insult to the Albanese government and to Foreign Minister Penny Wong. So I wish I could say that he was just an internet meme. It's much more serious, unfortunately, than that.
Finally, let's have a chat about the madness of this Kategate thing. Personally, I find the whole thing disgusting. There are people who I like and respect on the conservative side of politics who are adding to the whole conspiracy bandwagon, which I find astonishing. I mean, Rebecca, do you have a theory as to why so many people these days are quick to join this conspiracy frenzy? Because it's certainly an attitude that's on the rise lately.
Well, I did write about this in The Spectator Australia, and I think that, Kate and Wills, with the passing of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, they are undoubtedly, the most popular royals and the most popular family in the world. And I think there's an enormous amount of support for them and for the beautiful children. They're so photogenic, and I think people really warm to that. What the people who are opposed to the monarchy don't understand is that it's precisely because they represent families, and so many people have families, and they want to enjoy those uncomplicated pleasures of family life, and that's why they warm to a monarchy. They don't want to have politics sort of shoved in their faces every day. But I think what's happened with Kategate is that our trust has been utterly torpedoed by the whole way that the public health establishment handled COVID-19. People were continually lied to. People are still lied to about anything to do with health. And of course, people are worried when someone who looks as young and as fit as Kate, who's a slim mum of 42 and just looks a picture of health, and then she has something wrong, we don't know what it is. I really do understand why people are worried. And you sort of imagine that once upon a time you'd have Lord Snowden go in and take a nice photograph of her, even sitting there, soft focus, and smiling, even if she's still in a hospital bed or sitting down. And that sort of thing, I think, would reassure people. But of course, these crazy photographs and this weird footage that's shown, all of it, people have become very suspicious, and I don't blame them, because I think the problem is that we've been lied to too often, and now people don't know what to trust, and they don't trust anything.
Yeah, I do think there's a time and a place to question things. I think this particular questioning of Kate is a massive beat up, considering that she already told people she wouldn't be back till Easter, and it's not Easter. So she's not supposed to be in the public eye yet. And they started this whole thing, I don't know if you remember, by demanding that she give a proof of life, even though she's not supposed to be in front of the camera. And so I think this has just been a massive made-up media frenzy, because I don't think the media likes what's going on, so this gives them something else to sell magazines with. But a love of conspiracy, and you're totally right, seems to happen when censorship is on the rise and public faith in governments and the media is decreasing. Now, many remember the show from the 90s called The X-Files. Now, that was almost entirely about the exploration of conspiracy theories that had been around since the end of the Cold War. Now, instead of trying to silence conspiracy theories, do you think that perhaps, Rebecca, if we want to target misinformation, disinformation, the government should try, being more truthful and more reliable?
Yeah, well, I think that would be a great idea, but as we can see, that's not happening with anything. And like I said, particularly around health, all of a sudden it's become, a state secret. People sort of die suddenly and nobody's allowed to kind of ask questions. And we know from our personal experience that lots of people had, vaccine injuries, but it's sort of like, oh, you can't mention it, you can't talk about it. And we know, for example, that we still have ridiculously high excess mortality in countries like Australia, whereas after a pandemic that should be lower. But, thank goodness recently the Senate said, yes, OK, we'll that should be explored, that should be discussed. But we've seen in Britain, for example, how poor old Andrew Bridgen is just treated, you know, like, oh, he must be a lunatic to talk about this. And at the same time, some of our most reputable and internationally respected scientists and medical researchers and doctors are sounding all sorts of alarms. So, you know, it would be nice to think that we started, even if governments can't tell the truth, that we didn't have so much pressure to censor debate and so much labelling of people that somehow they are automatically wrong simply because they raise any of these taboo questions or topics. I don't see it coming anytime soon. I wish I did.
Fast forward, let's pretend it's Easter. And the Princess of Wales is out there with her family, you know, in the public where it's undeniable that she's not dead, as per claimed, they're not divorced, as claimed. Who has been more damaged by this entire frenzy? Would you say the princess was damaged, or do you think by that stage the media who went on the bandwagon will be damaged?
Look, I really just think it's part of the zeitgeist, and certainly in the piece I wrote, I think there's a lot of genuine concern for Kate's health. I don't think, you know, I personally feel a bit concerned. You know, it's like I constantly hear about people becoming sick and all sorts of things, and, you know, it's a worrying time for health and for people. So I don't, you know, of course, spin doctors, you know, get things wrong, and the media behaviour the way a lot of media does over certain issues. To me, that's not really the important point. The important point is that I think there'll be a lot of happiness just when we see her again and she's restored to health. I think people really care about the royal family, and they play a very important role in people's lives, and the sort of the left-wing intellectual elites, you know, constantly refuse to understand why that is important to people and why they care. But I think this is driven by actual care and concern. So I think roll on Easter, and hopefully she's great, and, you know, we can move on to the next thing. But as I say, what we do need generally is greater freedom of speech. Instead of, we see this whole, you know, war on so-called misinformation by the very people who purvey so much misinformation, and that's not going to restore anyone's faith in anything.
Yes, so I think you're right when you were in your article saying that it's a long way back for the media, it's a long way back for the political class to restore faith and trust in the institutions and what they have to say. But Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us here today on Spectator TV.
It's always a pleasure.